When you hear the words Industrial Revolution, what comes to mind? Probably steam engines, giant factories, a sudden explosion of progress, right? Well, it turns out that's only half the story. In this explainer, we're going to unpack the whole thing, a complex, global tale of two very different revolutions.
So let's start here. It's the year 1900, and this image pops up announcing the dawn of the century. You've got this angelic figure, an angel of progress, sitting on a wheel with wings, literally flying into the future. And all around her are the signs of the times: railways, cameras, factories, printing presses. This was the glorious story the West was telling about itself.
But you gotta ask, is that really the whole story? Was this progress for everyone? Was this lightning-fast, machine-driven change what was actually happening on the ground? Well, as we're about to see, the real history is way more complicated than these shiny, triumphant pictures let on.
To get to the reality, we first have to kind of pull back the curtain on the myth. This heroic story of the modern world became the dominant one, a story where Western technology and Western innovation are the heroes, the main engines driving all of humanity forward.
And this wasn't subtle. Just look at this illustration from an old trade magazine. It's literally called The Two Magicians. On the left, you've got Aladdin, representing the East, the Orient, building his palace with magic. And on the right, the modern mechanic, representing the West, building bridges and ships with his tools. It's all right there. The past versus the future, magic versus cold, hard, rational technology.
Okay, so let's start chipping away at that myth. We have this idea that large-scale industry all started with the factory. But long before factories ever popped up on the landscape, a completely different kind of industrial system was already booming all across Europe.
Historians actually have a name for this. They call it proto-industrialization. And what it means is you had massive production for a global market, but it wasn't happening in factories. It was a decentralized system where merchants in towns would pay peasant families out in the countryside to do the work from their own homes.
And here's how the whole thing worked. A merchant sitting in a town would give money and raw wool to a family out in their country cottage. That family would spin it into yarn, then that yarn would get passed along to the next cottage, maybe for weaving, then on to another for fulling, and another for dyeing. The final finishing touches would happen back in a big city like London, and then boom, off it went for export. It was this huge, interconnected web that tied the cities and the countryside together.
All right, so now let's zoom in on Britain, the heart of the first industrial nation. Because even there, that triumphant story of machines taking over in a flash, it just doesn't really hold up. The reality was a lot slower, and it depended a lot more on people than we think.
So here's the real contrast. The myth is this big, rapid explosion of machines. But the reality? It was a slow, gradual process. Yeah, new industries like cotton and iron were exciting and dynamic, for sure. But they didn't just wipe out the old ways of doing things overnight. For decades, traditional craftspeople and good old-fashioned hand labor were still the backbone of the entire economy.
And get this number is pretty wild. Even at the tail end of the 19th century, less than 20% of the entire British workforce was employed in those new, high-tech industrial sectors. The vast majority of people were still working in small workshops and out of their own homes.
So why? Why didn't everyone just switch to machines? Well, a lot of the time, people were just a better, cheaper bet for the industrialists. For one, there was no shortage of poor laborers looking for work, which kept wages really low. Machines, on the other hand, were super expensive, they broke down all the time, and repairs were costly. Plus, a lot of work was seasonal, like in breweries or printing, so it was just cheaper to hire people when you needed them. And honestly, some things, like the hundreds of different types of hammers or fancy goods for the rich, just needed a human touch.
And you have to remember, for the actual people on the ground, life was unbelievably tough. This is from a guy named Will Thorne, who walked to London looking for seasonal work. He talks about sleeping outside under a haystack, in a cold shed, running out of money, totally alone. This was the human reality hiding behind that age of machines.
Okay, now we need to flip the coin and look at the other side of this global story. Because while Britain was industrializing, its actions were having a truly devastating impact on its colonies. What looked like progress in a city like Manchester meant something very different in India.
It's easy to forget, but before the British really established control, India was an absolute textile superpower. Its silks and cottons were famous all over the world for their quality. They absolutely dominated international trade, and that trade was all controlled by a thriving network of Indian merchants and bankers.
But as European companies got more powerful, that old Indian network just started to fall apart. And this table, it shows the collapse in stark numbers. Look at the port of Surat. In the late 1600s, its trade was worth 16 million rupees. By the 1740s, it had crashed down to just 3 million. All that business was being diverted to new ports, controlled by Europeans, like Bombay and Calcutta. The East India Company basically came in and launched a hostile takeover of the whole system. They got rid of the local merchants and put their own paid supervisors, called gomastas, in charge of the weavers. They trapped these weavers in debt with loans, which meant they couldn't sell their cloth to anyone else, often for terrible prices. If you were late delivering an order, you could be punished, even beaten. It got so bad that many weavers just gave up, abandoning their looms and their villages to go work as farm laborers.
And as Britain's own cotton industry exploded, things went from bad to worse. This chart just says it all, doesn't it? In 1811, finished textiles were a third, 33% of India's total exports. By 1850, that number had collapsed to a measly 3%. The Indian export market was essentially gone.
So think about it from the Indian weavers' perspective. They were getting hit from both sides. Their international market was dead, and now their own local markets were being flooded with cheap, machine-made cloth from Britain. The new seal of quality, the thing everyone wanted, even in India, was a label that said, "Made in Manchester." So when you put these two stories together, the one from Britain and the one from India, you start to see a very different, much more complicated picture of what we call the Age of Industrialization and what we mean by progress.
Let's circle all the way back to where we started. That angel of progress flying confidently into a future of amazing technology. It's a really powerful image, but now we can see all the shadows it leaves out, all the parts of the story that are hidden from view.
So, what's the big takeaway here? First, the Industrial Revolution wasn't some single Big Bang event. It was a slow, messy, global process. It was just as much a story about hand labor as it was about machines. And maybe most importantly, the progress and technological leaps in one part of the world were directly tied to the economic ruin of another. This history is about power and people, not just gadgets and technology.
And it leaves us with a question that feels just as important today. When we see all the celebrations of modern progress, whether it's AI or space travel, it's always worth asking, whose stories are we telling and whose stories are we leaving out of the picture?